よはじねよはじねよはじねよはじねあべによべによべによべによはいへよべによべによはいへはよはじねよはじね
Welcome back to Voices for the Earth. I'm your host, Violet, and today's guest is Henry Lickers. I'm going to let Henry introduce himself, so just give an introduction of yourself as well as say what you do.
All right, I'm Henry Lickers, and I'm a Seneca, Turtle Clan. And right now I'm retired, but I've worked at Haudenosaunee here for almost 50 years. And I just finished a stint as the first Indigenous commissioner for the International Joint Commission, which is a body that looks after water that flows between Canada and the United States.
So the first question that I have for you, kind of just what I said, but there's more to it. So can you explain your work that you have done with the environment, how it's significant, and how it helps combat global climate change?
Well, 50 years ago, climate change wasn't really looked on as a thing. You know, the people didn't even really understand how much the climate was changing. I think the first paper I ever got scared of when I read it was in 1976, and it was talking about permafrost in the Arctic and how it was disappearing. And the person who wrote that thing said this was an incredible catastrophe for the world. You know, little did they know that years later they would see the outcomes of that paper. So when I first read it, I kept thinking to myself, what would the impacts be? And, you know, at about that time, I had come back from New Zealand doing a master's degree down there. And when I got back, I was looking for a job. And I heard that this small little reserve between Canada and the United States needed a biologist. And so I came down to apply for it. And I was accepted and then told, oh, yes, go out and solve all the problems, you know. And still kept in mind, though, all of those things that I had heard and learned about climate change. And it just so happens that among our own ceremonies, you can see climate change occurring over the last 5 decades. So, for example, just a quick one, is that when we do ceremony for the thunderers, you know, we welcome them back in the spring and then we send them off in the fall. What you're noticing is that the period of time before when we send them off to Florida and we welcome them back is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And as you see that, what better indicator do you have of climate change than that? In our basic way that we look at the world, we can see those changes occurring all the time. So, you know, we go through a Thanksgiving address. Well, each one of the things that we talk about in the Thanksgiving address has shifted in some way over the period of time that I've been here in Haudenosaunee. You know, when the strawberries occur, when our seed ceremonies go on, they just don't seem to be quite in sync to the way they were in the past. So for me as a biologist, this was an amazing thing. Here were our people, you know, thousands of years we've been here, and we've been observing all of these things. And suddenly, all of the things that my grandmother, great-grandmother, and grandfather were telling me about when they were young and how the ceremonies were held wasn't the same. So what more did I need to indicate that climate change was occurring? So at this time, you know, the Department of the Environment had started. A couple years later, the American side got one. We had the HETF were working on these things. And as we brought our people together, we could see these changes occurring over a much bigger area than just ourselves. And we began to talk about it. So Haudenosaunee and the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force, was one of the first people that held actual conference in Syracuse on climate change. We didn't call it climate change. We called it hazardous events. And we invited a whole bunch of people to come and talk to us about it. And then we laid out some of the reasons why we saw it, what was occurring. And it was interesting because the scientist, after that was over, came to us and kept saying, how do you know this? How do you know this? Show us the papers. Where have you written this down? We said, well, we haven't. Because why? We see it occurring. We know that it's occurring. So we have to prepare for it. And we think that, as the two-row wampum tells us, we got to shout across to that other ship and tell them that something's happening. And so that was some of the reasons why we did a lot of the things that we did, in order that other people know that this is occurring.
Wow, it's because I do know that a lot of our ceremonial cycles do correlate with, obviously the weather, and it helps bring some of it. And even just this past year, I think there might have been thunder in January or February. And I was kind of shocked at that, even just where I live too. And I didn't really notice, I know that even now, I just didn't notice that the thunders usually came more in the springtime, and now it's winter. And even just the way that I think something was going on with the maple trees this year too. I can't remember what it was, but it was...
Well, it's kind of funny because whenever I found something that was different, I always went to look for other people who were looking at that. So I became a director of the Eastern Ontario maple syrup producers, just for that reason. Mm-hmm. And because every year, when they hear the sugar bird, they call it the sugar bird sing, which is a saw-whet owl. When they hear them sing, they know it's time to tap the trees. But the problem was the saw-whet owls were singing too late. And suddenly, their own way that they looked at their own traditions wasn't being reflected in the environment. And they said, something's happening. And so I was telling them about our ceremonies and how they were starting to get out of sync. And when they get out of sync, this isn't a small thing. Mm-hmm. It's a monumentous thing to the world. For us in the past, it would have meant starving. People would have died. And so we kept track of those changes very carefully. And as a scientist, like I said, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for those indicators that can tell me that something is happening in this world.
So my next question actually does follow up with what you were just talking about. So how have you been able to connect our traditional knowledge of the environment with the non-Haudenosaunee or scientific knowledge of the environment?
Well, I use a story for that. And I always remember when I was young and I was going to university. And, I was learning all of the scientific most of the processes. I was in biology, all of the things that the sciences did and how they did it. And I was excited about that. It was cool. But I can remember coming home to my grandfather, and I was sitting on a table, and I was making graphs that showed predator-prey relationships, like how the predators, the bear or the wolves and the rabbits, work together. Now, it just so happens that the Haudenosaunee do have a legend about the rabbits and the wolves working together in order to keep both of the populations healthy. So I could translate that in my mind from a story or a legend into actual practice that the biologists were looking at. So I'm sitting there doing this, and my grandfather is looking at me, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm drawing the numbers of predator-prey relationships, how rabbits and wolves interact." And he said, "Oh, yeah, we have stories about that. You've heard those stories. So tell me how this works." And so I showed him as the numbers of rabbits increased, the number of wolves increased, then the rabbits crashed, and then the wolves would go down. And so you get these rhythms. And he said, "Oh, that's really neat?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "When you're doing that, you're making the numbers dance. And they're dancing across the page, and you can see them dancing." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Don't you feel sorry for your colleagues, your other students?" I said, "Why?" He said, "That's all they have. But you You have the spirit or the song of the numbers. You have the song that goes with that. So you're like a dancer. You can hear the song, you can feel the numbers, and you can dance to that numbers. And suddenly, you can see exactly how it works. So he said, isn't that cool? He said, if you use the dance of the numbers, the sciences, but use the spirit of the drum that you can hear when you're dancing, there isn't a problem in this world you can't solve. And so I looked at it from that way onwards. And every time I had a serious biological problem I was working on, I would turn to my own way of looking at it and see how that works. And then say, here's how I can bring them together. Not that I'm validating one against the other. It's that I'm bringing the knowledge systems together to make a stronger description of the problem and possibly the solutions. Our Thanksgiving address is probably the most wonderful environmental assessment tool that you'd ever want to use because it has everything. Whereas the environmental assessment processes used by Canada and the United States leave all of the spiritual stuff out because they don't know how to measure that, but we do. So there's some of the ways that you can bring them together, but you need people who can understand both sides. And that's a difficult problem.
That was so cool because I've never thought about it like that, especially from that perspective.
Well, there's a lot of little subtleties in this. You know, in sciences, we talk always about numbers to the base 10. But it would surprise a lot of people that the Haudenosaunee also have a base 3. We also have another base that's even weirder than that. It's the one we used when we were little, when you were counting cookies. And you'd go, there's one cookie, two cookies, another cookie, and another cookie, and another cookie. And you didn't know what the numbers were, but you knew how many there were there. And so we had different number systems for different things that we were talking about. In the Western society, you only have a base 10 number system. Oh, and now you have a base 2. But think of our people as we did different things. We used different number systems in order to be able to talk about that. So much so that, and yet to us it wasn't confusing. Oh yeah, that's the way you do it. Why is there only 3 words, the words of power in our great way of peace? Well, because 3 is the most stable of all of the numbers that you could want. Why is it that our people invented 0 when it took the Arabs thousands of years to bring that forward? These are simple observations in the world. And when you use your own knowledge, it helps clarify a lot of that.
So our next question is, what was the biggest lesson you learned throughout your years of being in the environment as well as working with it?
Well, I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that people who live close to the earth, and it don't matter who they are, believe the same things. So, our people, we talk about our living close to the earth. The earth is our mother. Everybody goes, duh, yeah, it is. But I found that every place I went in the world where there were people who lived close to the earth was always their mother. And so when I went to visit the Maoris in New Zealand and did my research work there, it was sort of like the Homer Simpson moment when I said to them, the earth is your mother. They went, yeah, who doesn't know that? Well, there's a whole bunch of those principles or tenets that our people live by. Responsibility is the best practice. Somebody said, what? Responsibility. Accepting responsibility for who and what you do is the best practice in the world, not rights and not laws. Laws you make to protect the minimum, and rights can only be limited and can be taken away. However, when I'm not doing the dishes with my wife and I'm supposed to be, I know that I'm not fulfilling my responsibility, and I don't need 2 lawyers to come and tell me. So our people focused on giving our people responsibilities and understanding them And of course it was difficult. And of course not everybody does it the same way. But we were tolerant and we allowed people to understand their responsibilities and work with them. And so our societies didn't need a lawyer. We didn't need judges. We didn't need police because we knew when we were not doing what we're supposed to. So there are so many of those tenets that are out there that people who are close to the land know. That's one of the greatest things that I learned. And I found out later that when I went to France and talked to a person whose family had lived on the land for 1,200 years, and I said to him, well, what's the land? Ah, la terre. But he wasn't talking about just the ground or the ground. What he was talking about is a feminine earth. That's where his people lived. In Germany, I thought, oh, well, maybe not here. They talked about the fatherland. And then I thought, oh, boy, that doesn't sound like the Mother Earth to me, until I talked to a person who was taking care of the Black Forest. And his family took care of that for generations. And when I asked him, he said, oh, yes, it's the fatherland, but on the Mother Earth. The earth is what spawns the whole of the world, and the mother helps take care of the father and all of the children that are associated with it. Suddenly I thought, I'm home. These people understand me, and they understand who they are. And so I haven't been to a place yet in the world where I found that people don't believe in the Mother Earth. So that's probably the most profound things that I learned as I've traveled around through the world and my things. That and our opening and closings, and then the Great Way of Peace. Those are powerful, powerful tools that can be used. But to find out later, like I said, that everybody else who lives close to the land takes care of the land. They believe the same way.
I haven't traveled as much as someone like you would, but it's something that I've noticed, even like in a high school class so I'm from Niagara Falls or Tuscarora, and we have this one class taught by one teacher, and I think I was the only student in that class for a good while, and we looked at different Indigenous peoples throughout the world, and it was kind of similar to how we all face the same issues as they do. And it's pretty crazy to think about, even just the way that we believe the same, just from having that connection to the earth.
Well, if you look at the world as it sits today, and I remember I'm analyzing this from a biology type of point of view, but also looking at it from some of the understandings that I have, what you see is that the four colors of the people that you have were put there for a reason. They weren't just haphazard. And they had a reason for who they are. And so in Europe, you had the rise of kings. Why? Because that was the way they lived. That's the way, and they thought. They think in that hierarchical system. Now you come to North America and try to put that here. Our people go, wow, what are you talking about? Women are the head of the, and this is what my responsibility is. They're not talking about rights, freedoms, all those laws. What they're talking about is what their responsibility is. So now when they come here and they see an open country where there's not a borderline drawn, it scares them. Because what happens if I go across that 1-inch strip? In Europe, you do that, and there's immediately a war. Yeah. In North America, the archaeologists have gone out looking for battlefields, and they can't find any. So one of their conclusions is, well, there must not have been many people. Why? Because in Europe, you can walk for 5 miles and fall over a battlefield in which 10,000 people died. Here, the largest massacres that we've ever been able to find in a battlefield is like 50 people. So where are they? There must have been no people in North America. And that myth still survives today, even though, we'll say, what they call Syracuse, or the Onondaga community near Syracuse, was 60,000 people with hundreds of longhouses, but no battles. And when I asked my grandmother about that, she said, "Ma, no, we don't know why would you fight? You're going to fight over a fish? There's a million more. Go take the other one." You know? Or you're going to fight over a tree? Well, there's a million other trees to take care of. And we took care of them so that they were there. She said, "But there is things that men will fight over." I said, "What's that?" She said, "Women." So again, what was it like if I were to bring that analogy to today? Well, our people do the same thing today. You know, the punch up after a night at the bar, that happens all the time. But it wasn't a battle of 10,000 men trying to kill each other. And so when you think about the peace that was here in North America, it was pervasive. I always like talking to my Anishinaabe friends because the myth of us always killing each other has been propagated by the Western society so much that some of our people actually believe it. And yet when you sit down and you talk, you suddenly find, no, that's not the way it was. And so I've seen so many of those type of myths that are out there. So what I would say to you is that we have to really look carefully and see. Japanese people are different. They represent that yellow race, which has a completely different system. And the black race, again, is different. And to me, I'm just, how can I put it, excited that the Creator would create such variety for us to be able to have different ways of thinking. Even the difference between men and women only took the Western society a couple hundred years to try and figure out that there is some difference there. And it's a good thing, not a bad thing. So we celebrate variety, I think, in a lot of ways. And our society and culture reflect that.
So this next question is kind of similar to the rest, but we know you're a scientist as well as a traditional Haudenosaunee. How were you able to bridge those two areas together within your work?
Well, it's like I said, it's being able, I think what you need to have is people who can integrate stuff. So integration isn't taught in university. You have to be able to learn how to be integrated. You also have to have the skill to translate, because a biologist talking to a physicist, they use completely different languages. So why do we as Haudenosaunee seem to have the advantage there? Well, if you look at our languages, we're verb-based languages. We're also completely different languages in many ways. And we have levels and different ways of talking, whether you're in family or outside of family. All of those things make a variety of words and things that we use. And so we have to, every day, have to translate back and forth between longhouse, between here, between there. And in doing so, you're learning how to describe things to people. The other thing you were learning to do at that same time is to integrate. So you take mathematics and you take baking and you say, okay, I'm going to make scones. So now I need mathematics to tell me what numbers there are and what measurements there are, but I also need Grandma's understanding of how to make it. Grandma didn't really use a cup. I've watched my mom make scones with just her hands and throwing things around, and said, hey, Ma, Grandma, how do you know? Well, that's half a cup, I think, plus or minus. You know, she had that numbers already worked out, so she could integrate between the two systems. She could translate between the two systems. And then the last thing we need is the communicators. Those people who can communicate from one system to the other and not feel that one is right or one is wrong. This is a different way of doing things. The same way a mechanic and an electrician may still work with electricity, but they work in different ways because of the systems they are. And I think, like, again, the Haudenosaunee are classic. Why do we have so many clans? Why do we have so many nations? And why were we always trying to talk to each other all the time? Because we needed to do that in order to keep the information flowing back and forth. So in my life, what I have found is that that's been the most important thing. You do research work, and if only shared among the researchers, it doesn't do much good. However, if you can translate it so that everyone can understand it, suddenly it becomes really powerful. And people begin to say, no, we can change that. And so I think these are the type of things that we have to look to. And I'm afraid that maybe it's Native people that are going to have to be teaching the Western society, because they have to change their education system in order to be able to adapt to climate change and all of the things that are going on. I don't think it's an accident that you have the craziness going on in the politics in the United States or any other place in the world. That's not an accident. That's inherent in the system that they've been trying to push upon the people. And I think maybe it's time. Maybe it's time for us to come out and tell the world how they should be governing themselves and how we can help them with that.
Yeah, I've seen like a bunch of things about climate change, as well as like how Indigenous peoples are helping kind of with the way that we function, help, prevent it in a way with the way we live. And I've seen a bunch of stuff like that where it's like we should teach them how to live and how to be more sustainable. But then I've also seen like the opposite side from it being like, oh, we don't really need to. We can fix all this with some laws and stuff like that.
Well, no, and it's like kids. If you ask kids, how do you keep peace among yourselves? Oh, well, we'll make all these rules. And then they break them right away. It's not, you become a teenager and then you want to break all the rules. It's not until you have some knowledge and understanding and work with people who know and have that concept of peace in their heart and soul and listen to the elders that are talking, that you suddenly start to get the aha moments. And I know I get them all the time, and I got them when I was young. I suddenly go, aha, that's what Grandma meant by that. And suddenly you feel a profound shift in yourself. What I've noticed, though, is that my friends, the non-Native people, when they're talking to Native people, and whether it's this big or that big, doesn't matter. They'll say things that you just sit there and you wonder at. They'll say, oh my God, that was so profound. What? That wasn't profound. That's just the way I was taught, and that's the Thanksgiving address. It's not profound. It's just doing what you're supposed to do. But to them it is, because they've never been taught to that way. Yeah. And so one of the things that I see our people can do, and with things like communication and stuff like that, is start to talk to them that way. You'd be surprised. I can go to a biological conference and talk parts per million and everything else you can think of. And is that what they want to hear? No. As soon as I start talking about the water as a spiritual thing, and as that way in which we look at water and use water and cleanse with water, it doesn't just cleanse your body, it cleanses your mind and everything. And suddenly they go, whoa, that's so profound. And yet to us, that's not profound. So maybe we have a purpose here. I think if the Creator wanted the Haudenosaunee to disappear, we would have gone a long time ago. There's a reason that we're still here. And I think the reason is maybe to start reintroducing our ideas back to the greater world. Climate change, maybe we can't solve it. In the past, we couldn't. When our people were living in the deep south, when the ice was on here, our people knew we couldn't change the ice. But as the ice retreated, we saw climate change and how it allowed for the collapse of the Maya civilization, and the Toltecs and the Amatics societies collapsed. And we saw that, and our people moved. So now we're seeing those same things happen again. And as we see them, we're going, oh my God, what do we do? What do we do? Well, I think we do what we did back then. As yes, we talk to our neighbors. We talk to them and say, look, guys, you can't keep going this way. And maybe, just maybe, as we say in the Haudenosaunee, if you don't have a solution for a problem, then don't speak about it. But if you think you've got one, it's your duty to speak about it. And so, having a big mouth, I go out and talk about what I think can be done and how we might be able to do some of these things.
So our fifth question is, while serving on the International Joint Commission, explain some of the ways that climate change has affected the waters of Lake Ontario in the St. Lawrence region.
Well, it flooded out the whole South Shore and is doing it more often than it was in the past. Remember, with the International Joint Commission, you have a long, almost 200 or 300 years of data, good hard numbers that you can see the water fluctuating. And realize that in the last decades, couple decades, you've seen more drought and more floods than you've ever seen in the decades before. Now, as a commissioner for the International Joint Commissions, it's our responsibility to regulate water flows. So to help stop these things. But what do you do when you have the 5 highest water levels per year in one 3-year period? You know, you can't go out and stand in front of the water and say, stop. It doesn't listen to you. But what we found was within the commission, we hadn't been telling people the right story over a long period of time. And so when I was on the commission, one of the things that we were looking at is how do we communicate with people in order to tell them about what's going on? And as we did that, a lot of the problems that people saw were saying, wow, we didn't know it operates that way. Do you realize that there were countries, or not country, counties, who didn't even look at floodplains and yet built houses right on the shore? Yep. And then were surprised when their house got flooded. Well, you then have to start to explain to them how our people did things. So, yeah, we had fishing villages that were right next to the shore, but most of our fields were well inland, away from those floodplains. Yeah, and we were a primitive people, and yet we knew this. And so, again, I think sometimes they think that the technology is going to save them from this type of stuff, and it doesn't. And when it doesn't, then they're so surprised. So, again, more education, more understanding, more knowledge, more stories. I was in Michigan, and we had a huge meeting with people there about water levels and flows and a whole bunch of other problems. And it was interesting to me because I was talking to them about our Thanksgiving address and how we deal with a lot of this type of stuff. And you would have thought that people never heard that before. And it was like after you had scientists running to me saying, oh, where's this written down? And I said, well, that's not written down. And they said, well, it's got to be written down someplace. I said, well, you know it. You heard it. So write it down. I said, go do your work. You think you're a scientist? Go do it. And, you know, from that, you saw people. The other side of it was there was a whole bunch of Native people there. And they came up later to get pictures with me. I felt like a rock star. But again, they were going, well, yeah, we've been saying this for years, and they just don't listen. I said, well, maybe this is what's happening right now, is they're starting to see that they have to listen. So I have hope. But the International Joint Commission also has a hard time because it was 115 years before they had an Indigenous person, myself, sitting on the IJC. I was the first. And the other thing that I would say to you is they never went and talked to Native people. So when I first got on and the rest of the commissioners, we sat together and said, what is one thing we want to do? And so we started visiting communities all across the Great Lakes and all across the border from the St. Croix River in New Brunswick, right straight across to the Columbia River out in BC and Washington, meeting with communities and then saying, can we meet with an indigenous community while we're there? This was unheard of. Even there, they had never even hardly talked to their own people. And so, again, we're starting to do that. Hopefully, now all of the commissions, all of the, committees and boards now have indigenous people on them. And they're starting to set up a circle of experts, indigenous circle of experts, in order to bring those people together so that they can help input our knowledge into their systems as well. So, did I have any effect? I hope so. It looks like it's moving forward. And I know that the new commissioner who took my place is Sue Chiblo, and she's Anishinaabe from up near Garden River, a woman, and I don't think they're going to pull any wool over her eyes. I think she's going to be telling them what to do. So I think this is a good time. There are things happening, and I have great hope.
What would you encourage the younger generation to do to help maintain our connection to the environment, but also help take care of it?
Well, I think the easiest thing you can do for an individual is plant a seed and take care of it, accept responsibility for it. You know, it sounds like a simple thing to do, but my kids, when they were knee-high to the grasshopper, they all planted our garden. They all took care of it. And then I told them the stories, told them some of the songs. They all know all about those. And I think that any child that does this, I can remember the awe of somebody, a couple of the kids, they were city kids, you know, the downtown hard, you know, hats on sideways, pants down to their bottoms type of kids, weren't listening to nobody. But I tell you what, when I told them that they could plant seeds using a ball of clay with a couple seeds in it, and they could plant them anywhere, they thought this was the greatest thing they ever had. So they made up a whole bunch of those balls, and one picture I have that's in my mind, and I got it at home, but it's in the front of the Royal York. They have planters, 4 big planters with flowers and stuff in them. And growing out of each one of those planters is a 6-foot-high sunflower. And I know that they didn't plant those. And so my kids, or the kids that I was talking to, I could just see them stick the seed in there, go on, and then it'd start to grow, and they'd watch it and make sure it was taken care of. But did that change them? Yeah, it gave them appreciation for the world. So for young people, I say, even the simple act of planting a seed and caring for it is an act that can help and spread through the world with this. So, yes, there are many different things, but do it to the skill that you have. You know, and you're not dumb, you're not feeble, you have strength, you have enthusiasm, use it. Use it in a way that shows that there can be peace in this world.
And that's one thing I've noticed about, like, even just the education system, how you're kind of forced to only do this, like, certain set of things, where I feel like in our culture, we can do whatever we are, like, more fit to do or what we inspire to do, kind of.
Well, yeah, and we know that people learn at a different rate. You know, I was the worst student that you'd ever want to see in your life. I can remember my kids found my, I think, kindergarten report card. And of the 230 days I was supposed to be in school, I was there 90 days. And why? I figured it out. If I walked 1 mile this way along the road and 1 mile this way along the road, I got to my school because my farm where I grew up was right here. However, I figured out if I walked across, it was quicker. Mm-hmm. It was shorter. It wasn't quicker, actually. And so I would set out in the morning across the fields. But you know, you have to talk to the badger because he's probably waiting for you, and I got to go see him. Oh, and there's that spring where these neat tadpoles grew. And the flowers that Grandma likes are on the way up there. I could pick some of those for her. And I should go check the apples to see how well they're doing. And so it would take me 4 hours to get to school as I walk across the shortest distance. And when I got there, my teacher, Mrs. Jemison, just had to be the greatest teacher I've ever had. And of course, the rest of the classes were almost getting ready to go home. And so she'd say, hold it, Henry's come. Henry, tell everybody what you saw today as you came across. And so I'd get up and start telling stories, and the kids would all go, wow, that's cool. She didn't have to do that. But I learned at a different way of learning. And I saw the world differently than anybody else. And if I was made to sit in that classroom, in that chair, I wouldn't have learned anything. And when I came off the reserve, and when I was about 12, I had a really hard time in school because I wasn't geared to working that way. It wasn't until I got to university when they told me I could take anything, that I needed, 32 courses, or no, 26 courses to get my degree. I ended up with 35 courses and audited 3 more. It was fun. I was learning things. And did it matter whether I got a degree in one subject? I ended up with 3 majors. They told me I would never go to research school. I ended up going to New Zealand and living there for 4.5 years doing research work with the Maori people. Had a great time. And so our way of learning is different from others. And unless our systems can start doing things, I saw here in Haudenosaunee, you have a Canadian system, you have an American system, and you have a freedom school. Kids here have a choice to be able to move. And I think that is wonderful because it gives them better opportunities to understand the way that they see the world.
And so leading off from that question that response is our final question, which is, what message do you have for the youth today and the future generations?
I'll give you the same thing that my mother said to me. She said, dare to be great. You don't have to be great. You just got to dare to. You've got to go out and do things. And the more you can do and the more you can understand, the better it is for yourself. And you have a golden opportunity to fail. You don't have to succeed all the time. The first cake I ever made was horrible. But, I learned from that. I listened to my grandfather. Sometimes I'd go, what's he talking about? And it took many years sometimes for me to understand what he was trying to tell me. But that's how everybody progresses and learns. And that deep learning that you need is usually pretty soft learning. It's not like I used to talk, my granddad used to talk about going to school as hard learning. Yeah, so like you're forcing it in your ears. The way he taught me, and my great-grandmother taught me, was soft learning. I enjoyed it. And it went in and it stayed there, rattling around my brain for 70 to almost 80 years. I feel happy about that. And I tried to use the same thing with my own kids. Sometimes they are still today going, Dad, I didn't understand what you were talking about. Now I do. Yeah. Okay, good. But that means that learning is a continuous process over your whole life. And you'd be very surprised at the places that you can find great knowledge.
So that was the last question. So I want to say Nyawa for allowing me to interview you.
Well, nice talking to you.
It was good talking to you too.
Now for our climate change fact of the episode. Let's start with a simple fact. Food waste is a major player in climate change. Every time we waste food, it rots in landfills that release methane, a greenhouse gas that impacts the earth worse than carbon dioxide. Plus, think about all the energy, water, and resources that went into producing that food that is simply being tossed away. Cutting down on food waste helps us in several ways, which include less food scraps entering the waste stream, which reduces the methane gas that warms our planet from landfills, It conserves resources that help to save water and land that are used in food production. It also supports sustainable farming, which helps farmers use resources more efficiently. How can we cut down on food waste? Plan your meals, buy only what you need, and use leftovers creatively, like composting. Composting food scraps also helps to reduce landfill waste, as well as helping regenerate the soil. By making these small changes, we can all contribute to a healthier planet. But I also wanted to mention that not all of us are able to make these changes, but if you're able to, it can help the earth out in the long run. To find out when new episodes are released, follow Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force on Facebook and Voices for the Earth on Instagram. I would also like to say Nyawa to Aaron Printup for the music. Nyawa for listening.
Haudenosaunee, Haudenosaunee.